Hello again, everyone. We're back again with another episode of The Fact, the series that has been discussing international issues since few years. Today, we're back again with three respected guests concerning the issue of Syria. We have Vanessa Beeley from France and Janice Kortkamp from USA, and also Patrick Henningsen from England. Patrick will join us later, but I will start the program about this subject with Vanessa. Vanessa, would you tell us about the situation on the ground in Syria? And I would like to know how much the Syrian government is actually taking control of the overall land in Syria, and I would like to know about the overall situation. I know that you have just returned from Syria, so I'm sure you have loads of information about this subject. So let's just start. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think effectively around 80% of Syrian territory back under the control of effectively the Syrian government. Now, of course, that doesn't take into account the still terrorist-occupied, predominantly Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, under its rebrand of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who are occupying the northwest, and the Americans, or the American coalition, with their SDF proxies to the northeast, and in Al Tanaf base, which is on the Jordan border, and also effectively Rukban refugee camp, which is a jihadi training ground, also on the Jordan border. And then, of course, you still have the Israeli occupation of the Golan territories in the south. But the majority of the previously terrorist-occupied, Western-backed terrorist-occupied areas of Syria have been cleansed of those militant armed groups.
Thank you so very much. Janice, what will be the impact of Hama's operations on the war that we have going on in Syria? Do you think this operation will have any kind of special impact or influence on the process of the war that we have right now in Syria or not?
I'm assuming you're referring to the offensive in the direction towards Idlib to eventually liberate Idlib. In Hama, in the countryside there, of course, there are many active terrorist groups, and the Syrian Arab Army and its allies have been bombarding terrorist positions with artillery and aerial strikes. I just saw a report today, that the ground offensive has actually been put on hold because of negotiations that are going on between Russia and Turkey. And so I'm not exactly sure what the situation is as of this moment, but it looks like the ground offensive has been halted, and this is rather unfortunate because of the momentum that was gathering there. And, this provides an opportunity for Turkey to move in even more heavy armaments to be used against the Syrian army in their country to take back their land from terrorists that have been supported by Turkey and US, UK, France, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. So with this new information, I'm assuming that the Syrian army will continue and the Russians, will continue to strike military positions of these armed groups within the Hama countryside as well as into Idlib, but we'll have to see what happens with that.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Vanessa, as you have seen the situation in Syria by your own eyes, and of course, Janice has actually seen the situation in Syria too. But I'm going to ask about the role of the countries that were somehow involved in this war too against the terrorists. and I'm going to ask about Iran and Russia. But first, let's start with Iran. So, can you explain about the role and position of Iran in this war right now, in current situation in Syria? And uh, would you please tell us about the, the influences or impacts of involvement of Iran in current situation of Syria?
Yeah, I mean, I think the recent Saudi meeting has tried to portray Iran as an interloper into this conflict. Of course, the opposite applies in the sense that Saudi Arabia is the interloper, funding and financing, arming and supporting Wahhabi terrorist groups inside Syria that have been trying to destabilize Syria and effect regime change on behalf of the US coalition for the last 8 years. Iran is a long-standing ally of Syria and has been invited to participate in defending Syria against international terrorism. Of course, Iran also has an interest, as does Russia, in ensuring that terrorism is defeated inside Syria to actually protect both Iran and Russia. So both those countries are entering, if you like, into the conflict in Syria for many reasons. But one of the main reasons is because they are very aware that the terrorist threat, if it is not contained and defeated within Syria, becomes a threat to Iranian borders and to Russian borders. There are obviously Chechen terrorists fighting inside Syria that Russia would be very keen to keep inside Syria and to defeat inside Syria. Equally, Iran has elements that are fighting within inside Syria that become a threat if they are able to then be utilized against Iran by the US coalition, who is currently ramping up, of course, the propaganda against Iran, threatening further sanctions. So we're seeing, a dangerous tipping point at the moment, and particularly in relation to aggression towards Iran. So Iran's role has been clearly a long-standing ally of Syria, a long-standing ally of Palestine. Both Iran and Syria have, if you like, engendered the war against them because of their long-standing support for Palestine. And that includes Hezbollah. It also includes, of course, Hashd al-Shabi, who are fighting against ISIS inside Iraq and defending the Iraqi-Syrian borders. This is another important point. Iran's role has been pivotal and crucial in supporting the resistance, like Hashd al-Shabi, like Hezbollah, who are defending the borders, who are putting the pressure on Israel and putting the pressure on the US coalition by putting the pressure on Israel, because, of course, you can't divorce the two entities.
Perfect. Vanessa actually explained very well about the situation and actually covered somehow about the role of Russia. But I would like to go into more details with Janice, if you may. I would like to know about the things that Russia has done so far concerning the situation in Syria and also in current situation that we are witnessing now in Syria. Do you think Russia's role is somehow a key role or a key position in Syria, and if this country is contributing a huge help to Syria or not?
Well, I think it's important to really step back and look at the way things have changed over time. Russia is the one nuclear power on the UNSC able to veto the resolutions that came up against Syria. And this was a huge factor with Russia and China using their veto to stop an Iraqi-style kind of UN-mandated coalition effort against Syria. So that was massive. And in fact, Vanessa was part of a recent documentary that is fantastic about much of that episode. So when you look at the battle maps, for example, from 2013, 2015 to now, it's obvious the impact that Syria's allies have made has been huge, and that, of course, includes Russia. When I was in Deir ez-Zor and Al-Mayadin. I got to meet with some of the Russian soldiers there. They were very impressive, very professional. Also in Homs at one of the reconciliation programs, the transfer of terrorist groups to Idlib from Homs. So they're very impressive and very professional, as I said. Their role has been one of, providing Syria with needed weaponry, as they always have, logistics support, intelligence support, strategic support, and of course in the air battle. So, their contribution has been huge, and they've lost martyrs themselves in this battle, and we've had amazing stories of their sacrifices. And so their role has been hugely significant for Syria now, as Vanessa said, being 80% back into the hands of the legitimate Syrian government. And, the momentum is building to regain another part of it back, which would be Idlib. On the other hand, there is some criticism of Russia's role. So, for example, in the negotiations with Turkey, after the great victories in the south, and there seemed to be great momentum with the Syrian army, and everyone was preparing last fall that the battle for Idlib would truly begin. All of a sudden, you had these negotiations with Turkey that put a stop on everything. And Turkey, of course, was not a genuine or an honorable partner in those negotiations, and they did not uphold any of their part of the bargain, so to speak, and they've continued to move in arms and supply the terrorist fighters there. And, the issue about the S-300 air defense system, Russia has moved those units into Syria, but the Syrian army does not have control over those. And that has been the cause of quite a bit of consternation because of Israel's constant illegal airstrikes against Syria. So it's a bit, I think there's a great deal of gratitude towards Russia for getting things to this point. There is some frustration now that, there are things that are put on hold that I think most people may not want to have put on hold because of these negotiations. And, only time will tell. Perhaps we've just heard there's an event that may have just happened that could change that formula quite a bit. And I won't go into that. Perhaps Vanessa can comment on it. So right now, as Vanessa said, this is a particularly precarious time because it's very clear that Syria has won this war, and yet the U.S. coalition refuses to accept defeat, to end their illegal occupation. There's this quagmire in Idlib right now, and Israel continues to violate every international law in their strikes against Syria. So, this is an important time, and as Vanessa said, everything is focusing on Iran right now, and things will get increasingly misleading. There'll be increasing propaganda that will build up Iran's role and build up this Russian role. So, for example, we just saw a video by terrorists in Idlib, and they were really pushing this whole thing that we're fighting Russia and we're fighting Iran. And that's pure propaganda in order to gain more Western support. So, unfortunately, we will see what happens now.
I think I have to come back to the fact that the reason that Russia and Iran, as far as I am aware, are fighting alongside Syria is because they are defending, if you like, their borders long term against the terrorism that is being contained within Syria. I think any country where their forces And Iran, very much like Syria, as far as I understand, the forces come from the people. So there is always going to be, I think, a public backlash when your forces are being committed to another country. But I think it's very important for people in Iran to appreciate the fact that Syria, not only in Iran actually, I mean, I think people in Europe and people in America should start appreciating the fact that Syrians are dying and Russians are dying and Iranians are dying and Hezbollah are dying, to contain the terrorist threat within Syria and to prevent it basically breaking outside Syria and into Europe and into America and into the rest of the world. So I think, you know, it's not only the Iranian people. This isn't kind of pointing the finger just at the Iranian people, but it's at the people of the world. You know, what the Syrian army and the Syrian people have withstood for 8 years, 8 punishing years. I mean, let's not forget, Russia didn't come in until September 2015. So between 2011 until September 2015, the Syrian Arab Army and the Syrian people, with Hezbollah and with Iran at that point, were defending Syria against international terrorism, expanding international terrorism, being financed and funded by the Gulf states, Gulf blood money, and by the Western coalition of intervention. So I think it's incredibly important for the world to understand how important this battle is. It's not only a battle for the regional players, it's a global battle that's going on now to destroy US unipolarity in the world for once and for all, to create pivotal powers, for example, Russia, China, Iran, in the future, who can have some kind of influence upon global affairs to prevent it becoming just a US coalition, supremacist reign. And so, you know, the implications of this war in Syria are huge, they're vast. And I think it's hard for people to pull back from their national issues and to see this as the global issue it is. But that's what we all need to do, not only in Iran.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for the explanation. I would like to go to next question concerning the U.S. coalition, and not only this coalition. Actually, we have USA, Israel, and also Saudi Arabia trying to achieve some goals since 8 years, and in these 4 years, in these 8 years, they actually tried their best to seek the benefits that they wanted from Syria. So my question is that have they achieved whatever they wanted, and if they have achieved any part of it, which parts were actually were the benefits that they finally took? And if you wanted, or if you want to give an overall evaluation about their attempts in this war, I would like to know about if they were eventually successful so far or not.
Well, you have to go way back to find out what the actual goals were, and we know that we can trace this current war back to, for example, the Clean Break document written in 1996, and the follow-up document written by the Project for the New American Century, the neocons that would come to power under George W. Bush, that basically accepted the imperatives or the manifesto of the A Clean Break document as what foreign policy they would pursue. In 2000, when they came to power under George W. Bush and the 9/11 event occurred, that provided the catalyst that was required to initiate this long-term strategy in the Middle East that Condoleezza Rice referred to as the New Middle East. She also talked about creative chaos. Seymour Hersh in 2007 referred to the redirection of U.S. foreign policy in those years. And so basically the general strategy was to destabilize much of the region and to create chaos and to pursue a course of promoting extremists based out of Saudi Arabia and in the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, and the other Gulf states, also the Wahhabis, the Salafis, and to kind of promote these Gulf state-backed extremists and the Muslim Brotherhood-backed extremists at the expense of the the ancient, the long-running civilizations of the northern swath of the Middle East. So that would be Palestine, of course, which is ongoing, but Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And this we know also by General Wesley Clark's admission of the 7 countries in 5 years plan. So, many people try to frame this as these as wars for oil. That's definitely a dimension. But in reality, it's a reconfiguration of the Middle East to become Israel-centric, U.S. Supportive, and the result of that, of course, being able to control the vast natural resources of the region, as well as having a stranglehold, if you will, over that very geopolitically critical region of the world. In addition, they wanted to lock out China and Russia from the region. They are really fighting back against China's Belt and Road project, for example. So this is a many decades long strategy that we've seen playing out. And in some ways, with the invasion of Iraq and the attempt to take control over Syria, they have achieved a certain level of chaos and destabilization that they wanted to achieve. However, Syria has put the brakes on that, and there was an article not too long ago in, I think it was Foreign Policy, talking about how Syria and Russia have ended this project called the New American Century. And, so people are recognizing, as Vanessa mentioned earlier, that literally what happened in Syria has been that the momentum of the neocons in this new Middle East has been stopped. And that is one of the reasons why the war has been so very brutal and hard, why the Syrian people have had to suffer and persevere through so much, why the powers that be, the Western powers that be and their regional allies refuse to admit defeat, as I said earlier, is because these are such long-range plans that, everybody has been invested in, and now, things are in flux with the stand that Syria has taken and the allies of Syria have taken. Saudi is a puppet of the West, and so they don't do anything without the blessing and really the dictates of the West in many ways. You have to really look at the major power brokers here, which is Israel and the U.S., the UK, and some other European countries. But basically that threesome of the U.S., UK, and Israel has really been directing this entire process for the last couple of decades. And these are the ones that are kind of in a panic situation now as they're seeing their plans unravel. That's my opinion.
Right, thank you, Janice. You actually covered some very important issues in this question. So I would like to go to Patrick. And as you know, it's been nearly 1 year that Israel tries to attack Syria's land directly by, just maybe missile attacks. So I would like to know about the intentions behind such attacks on Syrian land.
Actually, the attacks by Israel against Syria or violating Syrian airspace, attacking targets by air or missiles, as you mentioned. This has actually been going on continuously since 2012, 2013. It's been more visible and more intense maybe in the last 18 months. But Israel certainly has never respected Syrian sovereignty in terms of its airspace, nor has it done so with Lebanon either, and used Lebanese airspace to mount multiple attacks against targets in Syria. And of course, the Israelis will always say almost every single time that this is to attack Hezbollah, strategic targets, military targets, weaponry, or Iranian strategic targets, or things that it deems to be a threat to. Coincided in many occasions. This is documented, by the way, by a number of journalists and reports that you can find out for yourself. But many of these Israeli attacks have coincided with movements on the ground of so-called rebel forces or terrorist militants in different places on the ground at different times. So Israel's interventions have often been strategic and have aided terrorist forces on the ground. It's no secret that Israel is providing, in many cases, air cover, material assistance, weapons, medical aid to Al-Qaeda affiliates, even to ISIS forces in southern Syria in particular. So this isn't any secret. This has also been admitted by various Israeli officials at different times. This has appeared a lot in the Israeli press itself. So this isn't any sort of conspiracy theory at all. It's very well documented. So the question is, what does Israel hope to gain by doing this? Certainly it wants to, as much as possible, use this conflict to weaken the Syrian army, to weaken the Syrian Air Force, to weaken Syrian air defenses, to check Russia in some cases, Russian influence, which the previous commentators have mentioned, but also to hurt Hezbollah as a viable or successful regional deterrent against Israeli hegemony, basically. So Israel believes that if it can hit Hezbollah or damage Hezbollah in Syria, that it's kind of pushing it back and also hurting Iranian interests at the same time. It would also like to evict Iran from Syria, and it's working very hard with the United States to make this part of any deal going forward. But ultimately, Israeli security is just, it's an open-ended question, and it could never be resolved. Israel can never have enough security according to its own political doctrines and its own sort of worldview, that it always is under threat according to Israeli strategists and politicians, and therefore it must always push back, push forward in its frontiers to expand its territory, to create security buffer zones. It has done this consistently throughout its history. So this is just another chapter in a very long-running story, and right now probably the most strategic prize for the state of Israel will be the Golan Heights at the moment, and it hoped to take all of the Golan Heights if possible. It's been sort of stopped halfway recently, but it's declared sovereignty over this area, which has been internationally recognized by multiple UN resolutions, international agreements as being Syrian territory. So this is again a repeated pattern. Israel is declaring sovereignty over many things that the international community have deemed to be not Israeli territory, including the West Bank and many other things. So this is just the overall, Syria has just provided an opportunity for Israel to achieve its what it thinks is its security goals, to increase its territory, and with things like the Golan Heights, there's fresh water, there's arable land, there's agricultural land, there's oil reserves potentially there. There are already companies like Genie Energy who have already put a stake into the Golan Heights. They're building settlements there. So there's a number of reasons why Israel wants to take the Golan Heights. So really it comes down for them to resources and security, and completely ignoring any international law, any international agreements at all. And right now, the U.S. is acting unilaterally in concert with Israel to help the Israeli state achieve all of these things.
Great. Thank you, Patrick, for the explanation. Actually, there is some other aspect in this war that we have witnessed so far, and it is the role of Kurds and Kurdish forces in this whole situation of Syria. Their role has been somehow ambiguous to some people, and not everyone knows exactly how is the the interaction between Kurdish forces and also the government forces. So I would like to ask Vanessa about this kind of relation that they might have in Syria, and and also about the future of this interaction between Kurdish forces and central government in Syria.
I think, first of all, one of the main points I'd like to make, and it was a dear friend, Sami Ramadani, who made it to me. He said one of the greatest disservices to the Kurds is to call them the Kurds, because there are a large number of different factions within the Kurdish community, many of them with different aims and agendas, particularly in Syria, as we're talking about right now, but even in Iraq and in Turkey. So I think it's very important to make that point initially. Also, that the Kurdish population inside Syria is, I believe, less than 10%. And of that 10%, an even smaller percentage is in favor of separatism, of creating a separate state within Syria, and of course serving the US-Israeli coalition agenda in partitioning Syria along sectarian lines. So that's a very small percentage, which of course is being heavily power multiplied by the US and its allies, particularly in the northeast. The common enemy, if you like, for the Kurds and for Syria, and this is what gives the Damascus government leverage with the Kurds, is of course Turkey. And so therefore, yes, there are negotiations ongoing between Damascus and the Kurds, who are, let's say, not as strongly in favor of separatism. There was a really interesting point made by a commentator, Laith Marouf, back in March, and I just want to use my notes here because I checked back on what he said back then, because it's very important. An ex-spokesperson for the SDF, SDF, of course, is the so-called proxy forces of the US coalition in the northeast of Syria, particularly. Talal Filo was a former spokesperson for the SDF who defected to Turkey in March of this year. He himself is a Turkmen Syrian, so he was effectively implanted into Syria during the Ottoman reign. Now, he made some important revelations when he defected to Turkey about the SDF itself. What he actually said, and this is slightly the opposite to what I had understood, 70% are Arab, 20% are Kurds, 10% are Assyrian, but the Kurdish faction controls the SDF. The Arabs are used as cannon fodder against ISIS, for example, although I can argue that there is some degree of collusion between the two American proxies, ISIS and the Kurds, over various battles, including over Raqqa. Now, he also stated that the US effectively airlifted ISIS fighters during the Raqqa campaign and the Baghouz liberation, I put in inverted commas. And after airlifting ISIS, the US carpet-bombed Raqqa in particular, which again was a forced depopulation. Now, America is using the Kurdish Contras, the separatists, to enforce an ethnic cleansing agenda and a forced depopulation of the Arabs and the Assyrians from the northeastern area in order to impose the Kurdish Contra rule. And again, I delineate that these are Kurdish Contras, so they are power multiplied by the US. There are factions within those Kurdish communities who are negotiating with Damascus and who would prefer to maintain some kind of autonomy, but maintaining the territorial integrity of Syria. Now, these Kurdish Contras, according to Talal Filo, are starting to assassinate the Arab and Assyrian commanders and tribal leaders who oppose separatism, and that includes leaders, intellectuals, religious leaders from within the tribal community. The majority of the SDF, according to CEDAW, want a return of the Syrian Arab Army and the Syrian state, which gives them, as I pointed out in the beginning, the protection from Turkey. So this is a very complex situation, which of course is being made negatively, it's being made a negative impact on the Damascus government and on Syria's territorial integrity by the US power multiplying, but not only the US. A friend of mine, a journalist inside Syria, entered that region recently. Two things that he pointed out: there are you are able to interview former ISIS fighters from Europe, from Central Europe, but you are not allowed to talk to the ISIS fighters from the UK and the US origin. He also pointed out that there is a degree of blending between the SDF and the ISIS fighters. The SDF are now taking the ISIS brides whose husbands have been killed. So we are seeing a crossover between the two American coalition proxies. But what we're also seeing is a build-up of European and UK forces in the region. German forces were seen there, French forces, and UK forces. So clearly the Kurds, if you like, as I said, it's a very small percentage of Kurdish Contras who are working with Israel and the US to destabilize and partition Syria. So there is still a very strong chance, and I believe that's why the Syrian Arab Army now is concentrating its efforts in Idlib, because they want to basically cut off the head of the terrorist snake in Idlib before they can turn their diplomatic and political resolution skills to the northeast.
Thank you so very much for a complete explanation about the issue of Kurds. Here we go to the next question, which is the situation of or position of resistant axis right now in the region after this war. For this after this 8 years of war, the resistant axis has basically achieved some kind of I don't know how to say it, but maybe some kind of power. But it is something that some say that it is not basically a power which came from this war. It was something which was within the resistance countries in the region. So basically, my question is from Patrick, if you may. I would like to know about the actual effect of this war on the power or influence of countries which are involved in this resistance in the region.
Firstly, we'll say that it's by no means a positive thing that this war has happened in terms of like the amount of suffering and the amount of displaced people and the fragmentation of the country of Syria, the destabilization of the region. This has all been very negative. However, if you look at this in a wider historical context, this war that's been brought upon Syria by a gigantic international coalition of interests and powers from the West and the Gulf states, but even further afield in terms of foreign terrorist fighters, and also the economic sanctions that have been brought down on Syria, Iran, and before that Iraq, that has devastated the region economically, and also Yemen currently. But the positive result of this, specifically with the war in Syria, is for this axis of resistance, it has given these countries also an opportunity to prove that they're able to defend their territory, to defend their sovereignty, and to sort of mobilize regionally in an alliance. And so this alliance between Hezbollah, Iranian forces, the Syrian army, the Syrian forces, and you can also add Russia into this equation as well. Just that alliance alone has reshaped and changed the geopolitical structure in the region, whereby negotiations must include many of these stakeholders now, at least Russia and Iran being new mainstays in any negotiations, but also Turkey is also involved in this as well. So you could say the geopolitical center of gravity has shifted eastward, away from the normal venues of negotiations, of deals, which used to be exclusively in the US, in the UK, in France, in Switzerland, and now you have whole new venues that are making major decisions and charting the course geopolitically and diplomatically of the region, like Astana, like in Sochi, and sort of the main players at those tables who are making the decisions it's not necessarily what's going on in the UN Security Council anymore, but it's what's happening in the sort of Eurasian part of the world. And so Syria has drawn that center of gravity eastward because of this conflict, and that has strengthened this axis of resistance, one could say. So this is a very interesting development, and it's also allowed Iran, for instance, to demonstrate its capabilities as a regional actor. Your foreign minister, Mohammad Zarif, has commented on numerous occasions, including most recently at the previous Munich Security Conference, that Iran is interested in a collective security arrangement in the region, whereby regional countries can come together collectively and guarantee each other's security without having the U.S. be the main arbiter of all these decisions. In other words, so all decisions don't have to go through Europe or Washington, that they're going through a Middle East collective decision-making and security arrangement. So that's a very ambitious goal looking into the future, but it's actually become more of a reality based on what's happened and what we've seen take place, at least diplomatically. Just the mere fact that decisions have to go through Moscow. Now even Israel must confer with Moscow on many major decisions. This has totally transformed geopolitics in the Middle East and also in the world. So, but the axis of resistance, as you say, is in the center of this. And I might add that this doesn't just include those parties I've mentioned, but also it also includes Iraq as an important piece potentially of this axis of resistance. And within Iraq, you have the Hashd al-Shabi, which has emerged as a major military force, as a self-defense force in Iraq. This is certainly something that has made people in Washington and regional security. This means that together all these countries, from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq to Iran, can act as one regional interest, one regional bloc, and it can also project political influence from this arc of resistance. And all it needs now is to have economic prosperity, because with economic prosperity comes political influence as well. And then there's the issue of Palestine, which is also an unresolved issue. They're slightly detached physically from this axis of resistance between Lebanon and Iran, but nonetheless, this is an important factor politically, but also morally. Iran sees Palestine as a moral imperative. Its interest in Iran, and the supreme leader and many others have made this very clear, that their interest in Palestine is not first as a security issue or anything like this, but it's as a moral issue. This is a moral issue that needs to be dealt with in the right way, and Iran seeks to take the lead in this, because quite frankly, so many other Arab countries have failed, Gulf states in particular, to have any impact or do anything of substance with regards to the situation in Palestine. So, but yeah, and this axis of resistance also extends wider into the non-aligned movement, of the old non-aligned movement, which also would include previously Libya, and other countries that were repelling or resisting U.S. imperialism, Cuba, Venezuela being two others of note, but there are many others as well internationally. But this is certainly a strong arc of resistance which has formed as a result of this 8-year war.
Perfect, thank you. Here actually we came to the last question, which is basically about the future of Syria. As you know, in these 8 years, we had different politicians in different countries trying to say that Bashar al-Assad will go. And for example, we had Obama, Hillary Clinton, and all these, politicians and presidents and ministers in different European countries trying to say that the end of Bashar al-Assad will come soon, but it turns out otherwise, and all of them are gone, and Bashar al-Assad is still in power. So here I would like to know about your opinion, Janice, if you may, about the future of Syria. What is your, opinion about any kind of situation that might have happened or might happen in the future of Syria?
That's a huge question. And it reminded me of Mark Twain's famous quote about Damascus, that Damascus has seen empires rise and fall and crumble to ruin. She's a type of immortality. Ever since I started studying this conflict, I have known in my gut that Syria was going to win this and was going to come out stronger than ever before. I had no way of knowing what they would have to do to achieve that, which has been this 8 long years of nightmare and suffering and deprivation, and not just that, but becoming literally a pariah nation in the West, where people who want to go travel and visit other countries and study abroad were not able to. It just has made this really amazing, wonderful country a pariah nation because of the ambitions and greed of the Western countries and the regional allies. But like I said, they will emerge. They have emerged as victorious. They will finish this thing. What needs to happen in the immediate future is something that Patrick referred to, and that is the ending of sanctions. And one of the things that has to happen is for people in the West to understand really what the role of sanctions is against not just Syria, of course, but Iran and Venezuela, all the other countries that we're sanctioning. And that is literally to strangle an entire population to the point that they're so miserable they'll rise up against, the target of our regime change. So there's a perception change that has to happen in the people of the West to understand that sanctions are not some kind of benign, non-military option to use that only affects the leaders of these countries. That's nonsense. It affects the poor people the most, and it affects every normal person in these countries, and it increases corruption, and increases violence, and increases desperation, and increases terrorism, and the future generations of terrorists. So this is a bloodthirsty doctrine of these sanctions. If we can get the sanctions removed, then Syria will rebuild at an astounding rate. And truly, they are such productive, inventive, hardworking people. They want to get their country back. They want to get the economy to be robust and successful. And they will make this happen. It will happen much quicker if the sanctions are dropped and they can get international investment, for example, in much easier. But the opposite is happening, where the U.S. is placing additional punishing sanctions on any country that's helping Syria to rebuild and survive at all. So this is why the sanctions have been increased against Iran for daring to send Syria oil. Well, the U.S. is occupying Syria's richest oil fields and won't allow them access to their own oil, so they had to import it, and now the U.S. is punishing the people that were sending the fuel into Syria. And this doesn't just affect the military, like I said. People were starving this winter. They were freezing to death this winter. And that was the result of Western sanctions. So if those sanctions can get removed, and as we see more military victories, and as Vanessa was talking about, hopefully a diplomatic solution that pressures the United States to leave and end its illegal occupation, and to pressure Turkey to completely remove itself from Syria, which it must do, and then hopefully to get Israel to somehow vacate the Golan. So, again, it's a huge question. I actually have a great deal of hope for the future, but in the meantime, there's going to be continued hardship there.
Perfect, thank you. Actually, this subject of Syria is just something that we cannot cover it in only one session or episode, and there are loads of different aspects that we definitely need to talk about again, maybe in other episodes, like white helmets and different involvement of different people and countries in this war. But we are actually running out of time, and somehow we have gone somehow more than the normal time that we had. But as it is very important to talk about this subject, if any of you respected guests want to add anything about the Syria in this episode, I would be more than happy to hear it.
The point that Janice made, sanctions are nothing more than economic terrorism. We're seeing their effects most hideously in Yemen, where we see the UN, as it did against the Iraqi people, supporting effectively a genocide in Yemen. And I don't say that lightly. UN Resolution 2216, which was effectively sanctions against 5 named individuals originally, is being exploited by the US coalition and the Saudi coalition to effectively blockade, starve, siege 27 million Yemenis. And we're seeing the humanitarian disaster that is happening there, that is unfolding there, but it is being deliberately created. And this is what sanctions do. And this is what sanctions threaten to do in Syria, against Iran, even against Russia, to some extent, against Venezuela. We're seeing people dying from lack of basic necessities in Venezuela. We've seen the same thing in Syria. This doesn't affect the government that is being targeted by the US coalition. As Janice says, it targets the humanitarian sectors, it targets the agricultural sectors, it targets the educational sectors, it targets every single element of civilian infrastructure, and it disables the entire state, regardless of who is in power in that country. It disables the state, and that is the function of sanctions. It is economic terrorism, and the sooner that people wake up to that and start campaigning for sanctions to be not only lifted against the countries they're currently being imposed upon, but absolutely eradicated from our policies, from our agendas in the future. Sanctions are criminal.
The subject of sanctions, it's probably important to point out how these sanctions come into effect to begin with. And almost on every single instance, and we can talk about Syria certainly, but this is also the case with Iran, with Venezuela, also with Russia, with Yemen as well, that the sanctions are usually launched on the back of some sort of claim of some sort of international atrocity or international incident that sparks outrage. And normally you'll find that these are directly triggering the act of declaring sanctions either by the U.S. or by the EU. Certainly in terms of Syria, these are the two main parties. This is like a two-sided vice with the EU on one side, with the U.S. on the other, squeezing Syria in the middle financially and economically. And if you look and you drill down on what is sort of holding the EU sanctions into place, there'll be things like claims made about the Hula massacre, for instance. The regime forces carried out in some unspeakable atrocity or massacre, and this is one of the sort of pretexts for the implementation of sanctions. And there's a few other events that you could say have done the same thing regarding Syria. The same with Iran, and the same with claims about things that Russia has done or hasn't done in the Ukraine, for instance. And of course, same with Venezuela and so forth. So in almost all of these cases, a media blitz, a media campaign has to move to sort of create the narrative surrounding this, and it has to make its way to the UN and find its way into some report with witness testimonies from various, in this case, pro-rebel or anti-regime NGOs, many of them backed by the US, by Britain, and so forth. And this creates the narrative. This creates the kind of myth of whatever happened that's triggering these sanctions, the active outrage, and so forth. So as long as one of the important things in challenging sanctions is going to be to challenge the narratives and the sort of the claims made at the time, the emotional claims in the campaigns at the time. And if you can dismantle some of these claims made about these various events, blaming governments like in Syria, you then can weaken the ground in which sanctions were declared. And it's many of them are still predicated on things that happened back in 2013, back in 2014, 2012. And this is where we have this situation still today that we're dealing with. So it's a very difficult problem to solve because this is the weapon of choice right now, certainly with Western populations and politicians. It's seen as more of a viable option to wage economic warfare than to commit massive amounts of troops on the ground. So this is the weapon of choice right now. So to defeat this might be a case of also having to defeat the narratives that the sanctions are built on.
Thank you so very much, Patrick. I'm really sorry for this delay of time and actually this extension of time that we had. There are loads of information about Syria, so I couldn't interrupt you. And hopefully we will have you again on the program. And also, I'm really thankful to you that you covered so many different subjects on this program. We had the subject of Yemen and sanctions and all of them in our previous programs. And it is very interesting that all of these are connected somehow in this program. And so hereby, I would like to thank Vanessa Beeley, Janice Kortkamp, and also Patrick Henningsen. It is truly an honor to have you all in this program, and I hope we will have you again on this episode of The Fact. Thank you so very much, and goodbye.